the manual said. Never outturn a zero. Pacific skies. Spring 1944. The sun burned like a forge over the Solomon Sea, and the air shimmered with the heat of war. It was doctrine, a single line burned into every pilot's brain. Do not attempt sustained turning engagement with the A6M0. It wasn't just advice. It was a death sentence, waiting to happen. For years, the Japanese A6M0 had ruled the turn fight light, nimble and deadly, a marvel of minimalist engineering with an airframe weighing barely 5,000 pounds. Against it, the American P-38 Lightning was a brute of aluminum and rivets, a twin-tailed monster at nearly twice the weight, 2 engines, 2 booms, a central pod for the cockpit. It could dive like a meteor, but at low speeds it turned like a barn. The great controversy began with a dogfight that lasted less than 2 minutes. A squadron of P-38 Lightnings, twin-tailed silver predators, streaked above the clouds, escorting bombers toward rubble. They flew in formation, quiet, steady, confident. Then came the voice over the radio. Zeros. 11. Multiple contacts closing fast. The American formation broke apart like glass under a hammer. 30 Zeros dove out of the sun, thin-winged and hungry. Lieutenant Ethan Vance, flying the P-38 Widow's Son, banked hard left as tracers stitched the air behind him. The stick fought back. Every pilot knew that feeling. The torque, the stall, the aircraft begging not to break. But this time something felt different. The resistance was gone. The Lightning rolled tighter, sharper, faster. Ethan's voice cracked through the radio. Breathless. She's holding. She's actually turning with them. The Zero behind him couldn't follow. Its own wings flexed too wide. Bleeding speed. The P-38 snapped inside its arc, nose leveling with impossible grace. Ethan squeezed the trigger. 8. 50 calibers thundered in perfect unison. The Japanese fighter disintegrated mid-roll. Another Zero dove in from above. Ethan pulled again, harder this time. The Lightning twisted like a snake in a dive, rolled on its back, and slipped under the enemy's tail in one fluid motion. He fired again. Another kill. 2 kills confirmed. 1 pilot unscathed. When Ethan landed back at base, the ground crews crowded around, their faces a mix of disbelief and awe. His flight leader demanded, "How the hell did you turn inside a Zero?" Ethan pointed to the man under the wing. Sleeves rolled, wrench in hand. Sergeant Silas Lockjaw Cruz, greased to the elbows, and a cigarette clinging to his lip. "You're asking the wrong pilot," Ethan said. "Ask the guy who rebuilt her bones." Silas didn't look up. He was tightening a bolt with the quiet rhythm of someone tuning an instrument. "Told you she could dance if you let her," he said half to himself. The other mechanics laughed. "What'd you do, Silas? Charm her with a wrench?" "Nah, just gave her permission to move." No one understood what that meant. Not yet. But within weeks, pilots across the Pacific would whisper about Cruz's bolts. Parts scavenged from scrap heaps, filed by hand and banned by every manual in the air. And with those bolts, the P-38 Lightning, once called too heavy to fight, would start turning inside Japan's deadliest fighters. The manual said it was impossible. The sky disagreed. Mechanics like Silas Cruz didn't read manuals. They listened to engines, to metal, to movement. To him, the P-38 wasn't clumsy, it was chained. "You don't build a fighter that fast and then tell it to fly polite," he'd say. But the Army Air Forces didn't share his sense of poetry. In the Pacific, the fight for air superiority wasn't fought in factories or briefing rooms. It was fought in sweltering jungle airstrips where salt corroded every bolt, sand chewed through engine bearings, and the nearest replacement part was 1,000 miles away. The P-38 maintenance manual became a joke, a bedtime story written by men who never saw a palm tree. Command told the crews to follow procedure. Silas called it suicide. He saw planes go down not because the pilots made mistakes, but because the machines weren't free to move. "Those bolts they send us from Lockheed," he grumbled one night. "They're built to survive 30 years of peace, not 30 seconds of war." His crew laughed. "So what are you going to do, Silas?" "Build your own bolts." He just smirked. "Might have to." To Silas, the problem was simple physics. Steel bolts absorbed stress unevenly across the hinge lines of the control surfaces. The ailerons, elevators, rudders. Under high G-load, those bolts flexed 1/1000th of an inch, maybe less, but enough to create lag in the flight response. To a pilot pulling 5 Gs in a turn, that fraction of a second was the line between a victory roll and a flaming spiral. He'd seen the look on their faces when they landed. Men shaking, hands trembling, eyes hollow. Couldn't get her nose around, they'd say. The controls froze. The pilots blamed the sky. Silas blamed the bolts. Still, when he sent a memo about the problem up the chain, it vanished like vapor. The response came back weeks later. All components conform to specification. No deviation authorized. That night, Silas burned the letter in an oil drum. "Conformity doesn't win wars," he muttered. What no one knew yet was that he'd already started experimenting quietly, carefully. Every night after the day's repairs, he stayed in the hangar, working under a single lamp. He swapped bolts between wrecked planes, tested different alloys, hand-filed the heads for perfect tension. His crewmates thought he was obsessed. They weren't wrong. To him, it wasn't about breaking rules. It was about setting the lightning free. And soon he would do the one thing every regulation forbade: build a new heart for a war machine, from the bones of the dead. Before Silas Cruz ever touched a P-38 Lightning, before he ever saw the Pacific sky, he was just a kid in Ohio with oil-stained hands and a head full of noise. His world wasn't hangars and hydraulics. It was tractors, scrap, and thunder, the thunder of his father's old Fordson when it coughed to life, the rattle of grain silos in a summer storm, the hum of tools that sang louder than words. He grew up on a small farm outside Dayton, surrounded by barns that leaned with the wind and machines that never quite worked the same way twice. His father used to say, "If you can't fix it, you don't deserve to use it." Silas took that to heart. He didn't fix things by the book. He fixed them by feel. By 14, he could rebuild a carburetor blindfolded. By 16, he could balance a propeller blade on a homemade jig built from a fence post and a kitchen scale. When neighbors said his machines ran smoother than factory new, he'd grin and say, "Because they ain't scared to move." When war broke out, Silas didn't volunteer to fight. He volunteered to work. He joined the Army Air Forces as a mechanic, not out of patriotism, but out of fascination. The P-38, with its twin engines and twin tails, looked like something that shouldn't fly, and that made him want to understand it. At Lockheed's training depot, his instructors noticed something strange. He didn't use torque charts or rulers. He used his hands. He could feel when a bolt was right. Not over-tightened, not soft, just singing in tension. One instructor tried to reprimand him. "Cruz, you'll ruin threads doing that." Silas just grinned. "Threads don't break. People do. The plane just listens better than you think." He earned the nickname Lockjaw for how he tightened everything he touched. If a screw rattled loose, he took it personally. If a hinge squeaked, he'd strip the whole assembly down until it purred. When he shipped out to the Pacific in late '43, he brought with him a battered toolbox, a spool of safety wire, and a belief that every machine had a soul, and that soul lived in the parts everyone else ignored. But the Pacific wasn't Ohio. Salt air corroded metal overnight. Bolts fused into place or sheared off mid-flight. Replacement stock didn't arrive for weeks. Planes came back full of bullet holes and half the parts missing. One morning, Silas watched a pilot named Brick Henderson taxi in with a mangled P-38. The ailerons were barely holding. When they opened the inspection panel, half the control bolts had snapped like toothpicks. Brick cursed. "These planes are strong enough to fight God, but they die from the little stuff." Silas crouched beside the wreck, silent. His fingers traced the broken threads. Steel, brittle from stress. He muttered, "You don't fight gods with soft bones." That night, under the yellow glow of a work light, He started sketching in grease on a piece of cardboard. A new kind of bolt, scavenged from spare alloy, lighter, more flexible, tuned to the plane's pulse. He wasn't a genius. He was just a farm boy who hated loose metal. And that hatred was about to rewrite everything the engineers back home thought they knew about flight. Every fighter plane in the Pacific Theater faced the same invisible enemy: imbalance. It didn't fire bullets. It didn't drop bombs. It lived in the smallest spaces: threads, joints, pivots, hinges. It whispered through the airframe when a plane turned too hard or dove too long, and by 1,944, it had killed more pilots than most Japanese squadrons. The P-38 Lightning was a masterpiece of engineering theory. But in combat, theory met vibration, heat, and G-force. Its twin Allison engines could generate over 1,600 horsepower each. But all that power passed through a skeleton of bolts designed for longevity, not agility. Silas Cruz didn't need a blueprint to see it. He could hear imbalance. When a plane came in from a mission, he'd listen to the tick of its cooling metal, the uneven clicks, the subtle shifts in temperature where tension had failed. "That's not stress," he'd say. "That's hesitation." The numbers were brutal. In field reports, 28% of P-38 seconds lost to unexplained mechanical failure were traced back to stress fractures along hinge lines and control linkages. At high speeds, 300 to 400 miles per hour, those tiny fractures turned milliseconds of delay into death spirals. The Lightning's roll rate averaged 75 degrees per second, respectable for its size, but sluggish compared to the Zero's 110 degrees. Pilots called it the lag, a delay between movement and response that made the plane feel like it was arguing back. Silas hated that word, lag. To him, lag meant disobedience. And he wasn't about to let a machine disobey. He began breaking down damaged control assemblies and testing every bolt that came through the shop. Some bent under tension, others snapped. But once he found something different, a salvaged alloy bolt from a wrecked Corsair that flexed instead of breaking. The metal had memory. It returned to its shape under pressure. That's when the math hit him. It wasn't about making bolts stronger. It was about making them smarter. If he could replace the rigid factory bolts in the aileron hinge with high-tensile memory flex alloy, the wings could twist just enough to distribute stress instead of absorbing it. Less resistance meant faster roll response. Faster roll meant tighter turns. Tighter turns meant survival. He scribbled the numbers on the side of a toolbox. Plus 30 degrees, roll in 0.3 yields. 0 overshoots. The problem: none of this was approved. The Army's technical order manual stated explicitly, use only factory standard components for airframe control systems. Unauthorized substitution constitutes violation of command maintenance doctrine. He showed the math to his commanding officer. The response was curt. "Sergeant, if the designers at Lockheed didn't do it, there's a reason." Silas bit back a grin. "Yeah, sir. The reason's called fear. Every engineer back home was designing for stability. Every pilot out here was dying for maneuverability. And between those two priorities, in that space between theory and blood, was the truth Silas was chasing." That night, under the humming of cicadas and the distant echo of bombers, Silas laid out 3 bolts on a workbench. 1 factory steel, 1 field-forged, 1 scavenged alloy. He weighed them, flexed them, tapped them with a wrench. The tone of the third sang higher, purer, like metal tuned to the sky. He smiled. There it is. The next morning, he'd install it, not in a test rig, not in theory, but in a combat-ready P-38, bound for another raid over Rabaul. If it failed, the pilot would die. If it worked, the Lightning would finally live up to its name. The hangar at Doadura Airfield smelled of oil, salt, and defiance. It was a place where war met ingenuity, where engines screamed louder than rules. Silas Cruz stood beneath the gleaming wings of a battered P-38 Lightning, a cigarette tucked behind one ear, sleeves rolled high, wrench in hand. The tag on the plane read, grounded, control response failure. To most mechanics, that meant paperwork. To Silas, it meant opportunity. He'd been planning this for weeks. The first full installation of his bolt swap. Not a test, not theory. A real, breathing, combat machine. He had scavenged high-tensile bolts from a wrecked Corsair, their alloy born to handle violent torque and heat. He hand-filed each one under a single flickering light, humming softly as metal dust floated through the air. Each bolt went into the aileron hinges with surgical precision. The torque wrench clicked. The thread lines vanished, and the wings seemed to relax, like a fighter stretching its shoulders after years of stiffness. "Cruz, what the hell are you doing?" Came a voice behind him. It was Corporal Rudd, another mechanic, nervous and sunburned. "Fixing what Lockheed forgot," Silas muttered. "You can't just change hardware like that. You'll get grounded, man. Or worse," Silas smirked. "If this works, no one's going to care what I used. If it doesn't, nobody will be around to complain." By dawn, the Lightning was ready. The pilot, Lieutenant Ethan Vance, same one from the Raboul mission, walked over, squinting at the controlled surfaces. "You sure this bird's airworthy?" "She'll dance," Silas said simply. Ethan shook his head but trusted him. Silas had earned that much. "If I die, I'm haunting you. Then make sure you fly good enough to come back and do it." They rolled the plane onto the coral strip. The engines roared. Twin Allisons, snarling like chained animals, suddenly set free. The tower cleared him for a test flight. Jack throttled up, dust billowing behind. The Lightning leapt from the ground like it was lighter than air. Silas stood outside the hangar, arms folded, eyes locked on the silver streak, cutting across the dawn. At 5,000 feet, Jack tested the roll. The Lightning flipped so fast he nearly blacked out. His voice crackled over the radio. "Jesus, Silas, what did you do to her?" Silas just grinned. "Made her honest." Jack climbed higher, pulled into a sustained turn. Tighter, smoother, perfectly balanced. No lag, no chatter. The control response was instant. Fluid. He dove, banked, rolled again. The G-forces that once twisted the airframe now flowed through it like rhythm. When he landed 20 minutes later, he stepped out pale and shaking. Half from adrenaline, half from disbelief. "She turns like a zero," he said quietly. Word spread fast. Other pilots wanted the same fix. Command got wind of it, too. Within days, an officer stormed into the hangar waving a clipboard. "Cruz, what's this I hear about unauthorized modifications?" Silas looked up from his toolbox, unbothered. "Just swapped a few bolts, sir. You compromised a government asset." "No, sir," Silas said, meeting his eyes. "I made it harder to shoot down." The officer ordered him to remove the bolts immediately, but the pilots had already seen the results. They refused to ground their planes. In combat zones, the rule book didn't outrank survival. For the next weeks, Silas worked non-stop under rain, under fire, under threat of court-martial, fitting his forbidden bolts into every Lightning that rolled through his bay. By the time command caught up with him again, it was too late. Those modified P-38 seconds had already flown and returned from missions no one expected them to survive. They were rolling faster, climbing tighter, and for the first time, outturning the zero. A single act of disobedience had just shifted the balance of the Pacific sky. A week later, the Pacific sky roared with something new. The sound of freedom disguised as torque. Pilots who once dreaded low altitude turns now dove into them with confidence. P-38 seconds rolled like prize fighters, juking and snapping around enemy bursts that used to end in smoke trails. It wasn't supposed to happen. Not by the book. Not by design. Back in the hangar, the brass finally descended, not in bombers, but in jeeps and clipboards. Engineers, inspectors, maintenance officers, the kind who spoke in acronyms and measured courage in paperwork. They demanded to see the planes. They wanted the bolts. Silas stood beside one of his Lightnings, arms crossed. "You can take a look," he said, "but I ain't pulling them out." The lead inspector, Captain Winfield, scoffed. "You violated 2 separate field orders, Sergeant. Unauthorized material substitution and structural modification. Silas wiped his hands on a rag. I call it survival. Winfield gestured to the aileron. You're telling me you replaced certified Lockheed hardware with junk from a scrapyard? Silas leaned closer, pointing at the joint. Not junk. Smart metal. She flexes under load, distributes stress. The stock bolts fight it, then snap. These ones bend with it. The captain frowned. That's not how aircraft design works. Maybe not in California, Silas shot back, but it works just fine out here. They took samples, scribbled notes, muttered about violations, but none of it mattered once the combat reports came in. Pilots flying Cruise's Lightnings were returning with higher survival rates, tighter turns, and fewer stress failures. Their roll rate had jumped nearly 40%. Structural fatigue was down. The planes weren't breaking anymore, they were flowing. In an after-action debrief, one pilot wrote, "Feels like the plane finally knows what I'm trying to do." Another simply said, "She dances." Engineers back in the States couldn't believe it. They ran simulations trying to explain the impossible data. Eventually, one of them, a young metallurgist from Purdue, figured it out. The scavenged alloy Silas used wasn't just tougher. It was elastic. Whereas standard bolts absorbed energy until failure, his alloy flexed microscopically under load, returning to form with each roll. That micro-deflection reduced control lag by 0.3 seconds. A lifetime in a dogfight. The Air Corps called it an anomaly. The pilots called it a miracle. Silas called it common sense. The engineers build to survive physics, he told one officer. We build to use it. Word spread up the chain of command. Quietly, Lockheed sent out a bulletin to Pacific maintenance units. Field reports suggest improvements in control responsiveness. Local evaluation of alternative fasteners, authorized under emergency conditions. They never mentioned Silas by name. They didn't have to. Every man in the Pacific knew who alternative fasteners meant. From that day on, he wasn't just fixing planes. He was rewriting doctrine. Still, not everyone was thrilled. One night, his commanding officer found him working alone again, sleeves rolled, sweat glistening in the lantern light. "You know they're calling you the outlaw mechanic," the captain said. Silas didn't look up. Outlaws don't care about rules. I just care about gravity. Why keep pushing it? He finally paused, wrench in hand, eyes fixed on the shimmering bolt he just fitted. Because every pilot who comes home means I was right, and I like being right. Out on the flight line, another P-38 howled into the night, banking, rolling, climbing into a sky it was never designed to own. In the quiet after it disappeared, the captain shook his head. "You're going to get written up for this." Silas smiled faintly. "Maybe, but she'll fly better for it." And she did. The mission was supposed to be routine. A bomber escort over Rabaul. A fortress of guns and smoke that chewed through careless pilots like a meat grinder. The morning air was slick with humidity, the kind that made every instrument sluggish, every breath heavy. Lieutenant Ethan Vance sat in his cockpit tapping the control yoke of his P-38 Widow's Son. Under his boots, the pedals felt alive, taut, responsive. It wasn't the same aircraft he'd flown weeks earlier. It was quicker, sharper, more instinctive, almost like it was reading his thoughts. He'd flown a dozen sorties since Silas's bolt swap, and every time the plane felt more like an extension of himself. He didn't trust anyone's mechanics except Silas's. "Now she's not just metal anymore," he told his wingman. "She's a mood." The formation climbed to altitude, 12 Lightnings slicing through the sky, escorting a group of B-24 Liberators, headed for a Japanese airfield. Then came the call from the lead. "Bandits too high. Closing fast. Zeros." The horizon bloomed with white wings. 20, maybe 30. Zeros diving in perfect formation. They were faster at the climb, lighter in the turn, and hellishly precise. The kind of pilots who believed in inevitability, that every American plane was just one mistake away from smoke. But not this time. Ethan pushed the throttle. The Lightning surged forward. As tracer rounds flashed by, he pulled into a hard right roll, a suicide move against a zero. But instead of locking up or groaning under stress, the P-38 flowed. It turned inside its own radius, banking so tight he could feel his helmet press into the canopy. His wingman's voice cracked over the radio. "Jesus, Ethan, you'll tear her apart." "She likes it." The Zero chasing him couldn't hold the turn. Its wings shuddered, overshooting the lightning's tight arc. Ethan reversed, snapped the nose around, and let his guns roar. The Zero exploded into fragments, fire trailing through the clouds. The radio erupted with disbelief. Did he just outturn a Zero? Before anyone could answer, 3 more Japanese fighters dropped from above. Ethan broke left, dove, then climbed in a spiral. The P-38 clawed for altitude, those forbidden bolts flexing with every move, the control feedback alive in his fingertips. The lightning didn't resist. It danced. He came up behind the lead Zero, firing short bursts that stitched across its fuselage. The second he rolled away, another Zero tried to follow. But the American fighter snapped into a vertical climb that no factory-spec P-38 could have held. Widow's Sun leveled out at 9,000 feet. The sky was littered with contrails and burning wrecks. By the end of the dogfight, Ethan's squadron had shot down 7 Zeros. They lost none. Back at base, the airstrip was chaos. Cheering, disbelief, adrenaline. The pilots gathered around the dusty P-38, pointing to its wings, running hands along the seams like touching a talisman. One of them turned to Silas. "Whatever the hell you did, do it to mine." Silas didn't celebrate. He just stared at the plane, eyes locked on the bolts, glinting under the wing. He knew what that victory meant and what it would cost him if command decided to notice. That night he sat outside the hangar, cigarette glowing in the dark, listening to the faint pops of distant anti-air fire. He wasn't thinking about rules or credit or punishment. He was thinking about physics, about how steel that bends doesn't break, about how the world's fastest fighter had finally learned to turn like its lighter enemy. And somewhere in that humming silence of cooling engines, Silas Cruz realized he hadn't just fixed a plane. He'd changed the way it moved through the world. By late 1944, the war in the Pacific had turned into a storm of motion and fuel. Japan was losing ground, but still fought with ferocity in the skies. Supply convoys, known by the Americans as the Tokyo Express, darted between island strongholds, guarded by Zeros and flak cannons that spat death into the sea. On a humid December morning, the 431st Fighter Squadron, the same outfit flying Silas's modified P-38 seconds, received orders to intercept a formation of enemy bombers heading toward Allied shipping lanes near Muro. The mission was straightforward: stop the convoy, protect the fleet. What wasn't straightforward was what awaited them above the clouds. Lieutenant Ethan Vance, again flying Widow's Sun, was leading the second element. The air was thin at 28,000 feet. His plane shuddered as it climbed, condensation freezing along the canopy edges. Below him, the ocean glimmered like black glass. "Keep eyes up," Vance said over the radio. "They'll be diving out of the sun." He was right. Within minutes, black dots appeared above the glare. Japanese fighters diving fast and furious. At least 15 Zeros flying escort for a column of bombers. Contact coming down hard. The formation scattered. P-38 seconds broke into rolling maneuvers. Each pilot trusting their machine and their mechanic more than any command order. The first wave of Zeros slashed through, guns flashing. But this wasn't 1,942 anymore. The Lightning pilots knew their planes. They knew how far to push, how fast to turn. Silas's bolts had become an unspoken weapon. Vance dove, flipped into a tight left spiral, then climbed hard. 5 Gs, then 6. He felt his vision narrow, his breath freeze. Yet the Lightning didn't stiffen or stall. She responded like she was built for this exact moment. A Zero tried to match the move and overshot instantly. Vance pulled the trigger. His guns lit up and the Japanese plane vanished into flame. "Nice turn." "Ethan," came the radio crackle from another pilot. "You using Silas's magic metal up there?" "Hell yes," Vance shot back, "and it's singing across the sky." The modified P-38 seconds moved like dancers through chaos. Their roll rates were sharper, their turns tighter. Where earlier lightnings would have bled speed and drifted wide, these held their arcs clean and true. Below them, the Tokyo Express erupted in fire as bombers were shredded before they reached the fleet. The dogfight lasted 12 minutes. By the end, 12 Japanese aircraft were confirmed, destroyed with no American losses. When they returned to base, something remarkable happened. The squadron maintenance officer, a by-the-book captain who'd once written Silas up for material violation, walked across the tarmac, silent. He stopped in front of Silas, extended a hand, and said, "Only one thing. How soon can you do the rest?" Silas stared for a moment, grease on his hands, eyes tired but proud. "As soon as you stop asking permission." Within a week, his modifications had quietly spread through the Pacific, not as an order but as a rumor. A whispered truth passed from pilot to mechanic, from island to island. If you want your lightning to live, give it cruise bolts. Officially, there was no such thing. No memos, no authorizations, no paperwork, just results. And that's how an illegal bolt swap became one of the most effective unrecorded engineering upgrades of World War II. A field innovation born not in labs or factories, but in heat, noise, and defiance. Outlaw engineering had done what billions of dollars in design couldn't. It gave the heaviest fighter in the Pacific the soul of a Zero. Silas didn't get medals. He got something better every pilot he'd ever saved. Bringing him a can of beer, a handshake, or a nod that said more than words ever could. When the next mission brief came through long-range escort to Luzon, pilots fought to fly the planes that had his touch. Because everyone knew when a P-38 moved like that, it wasn't just flying, it was alive. By January 1945, word of the cruise mod had reached places Silas never imagined. Wright Field, Lockheed's headquarters, even the Pentagon's engineering division. None of them knew the full story, of course. Official reports simply described field mechanical variations resulting in improved roll performance. But behind the paperwork, the numbers told a truth no one could ignore. Modified P-38 seconds were surviving dogfights they had no right to win. Squadron records showed a 23% increase in mission return rate. Maintenance logs revealed fewer stress fractures, fewer mid-air control failures, and tighter turn performance in every recorded sortie. The Army Air Forces ran post-combat tests using one of the cruise planes. At high G loads, the data stunned engineers. 45% faster aileron response, and roll acceleration up to 110 degrees per second. The prototype bolts had survived over 70 simulated dogfights without a single structural failure. In short, the illegal fix had made the impossible machine finally live up to its name. Lightning. But Silas Cruz didn't see any of that. He wasn't invited to the tests or the meetings. He was still at his makeshift hangar in the Philippines, crouched under wings, tightening bolts covered in oil and sunburn. One evening, an envelope arrived. Official U.S. Army Air Force letterhead. He opened it slowly. Inside was a single typed page. Effective immediately. Use of alternative alloy fasteners approved under combat conditions where standard supply is unavailable. No signature, no credit, just quiet vindication. He laughed, not bitterly, just tired. Took them long enough, he said to himself, flicking his cigarette into the dirt. That night, Ethan Vance found him sitting by a P-38 wing, polishing a wrench like a relic. "You did it, Silas," Ethan said. "They're finally admitting it works." Silas didn't look up. "Yeah, but they'll never admit who did it." Ethan smirked. "You care?" Silas thought for a moment. "Nah, the sky knows." They sat in silence, listening to distant thunder. Or maybe not thunder. Maybe it was a squadron of P-38 seconds overhead, rolling in tight formation, their wings flexing in perfect harmony with the wind. In the months that followed, Every new lightning off the line incorporated lessons from Silas's fieldwork. They didn't call them Cruz's bolts, but the metallurgy, the tolerance, the flex, all of it came from his blueprint, scrolled in oil on a toolbox. After the war, Lockheed engineers re-examined hundreds of combat-returned airframes. In a declassified 1947 report, they confirmed what Silas had known instinctively. Structural elasticity under aerodynamic load contributes significantly to control harmony. That phrase, control harmony, became standard language in every aircraft design manual after 1948. Silas never read it. He went home to Ohio, back to his father's barn and the smell of dust and oil. Built a workshop out of old hangar scrap, fixed tractors, repaired crop dusters. He never talked much about the war, but every once in a while, when he heard the drone of an airplane overhead, he'd stop whatever he was doing, look up, and smile. Because somewhere out there, in every aircraft that rolled, banked, and trusted its wings, was a whisper of his defiance. He'd been called a violator, a risk, a problem. But when history turned the last page, Silas Cruz had done what no factory ever could. He'd made perfection bend. Years later, when the war was only a ghost flickering on grainy film reels, the stories still found their way around air shows and veterans' bars. Pilots would gather under the wings of restored Lightnings, beer in hand, and someone would always bring up the legend of Lockjaw Cruz, the outlaw mechanic who made steel dance. They'd point at the control surfaces, the tight geometry of the hinges, the clean roll of the twin tails, and one of them would say, "You see that? Planes didn't always move like that." Not till a farm boy decided the rules didn't apply to him. In one of those shows, late in the summer of '63, a silver P-38 performed a low pass over a small Ohio airfield. The crowd cheered as it banked gracefully, slicing the horizon with that unmistakable twin boom. Near the fence line stood an old man in a faded army mechanic's jacket, cigarette smoke curling around his weathered face. He didn't clap. He just watched. When the pilot landed, he taxied over, climbed out, and saw the old man waiting. "You Silas Cruz?" the pilot asked. "Used to be," Silas said. The pilot grinned. "This one's got your fingerprints in her bolts. They say your fix saved more pilots than armor ever did." Silas chuckled, voice gravelly. "Funny, they banned that fix when I built it." The pilot nodded toward the plane. They unbanned it after it started winning dogfights. The two men stood there in silence, looking at the aircraft gleaming under the sun. After a while, Silas reached into his pocket, pulled out a small hand-filed bolt, the last of the originals. The metal was polished smooth from decades of touch. He handed it to the pilot. "She won't need it," he said softly. "But keep it close anyway. Reminds her what she's made of." The pilot looked down at the bolt, then back at him. "You ever miss it?" Silas smiled faintly. "I never left it. Every time one of those birds takes off, part of me is up there holding her together." As the pilot climbed back in, the old man turned away, walking slowly toward his truck parked by the cornfield. The P-38's engines came alive again, that deep, even hum that shook the air. The plane lifted off, circled once, and dipped its wings in salute. Silas raised a hand without turning around. Just one small gesture. Steady, confident. The kind of salute only a man who truly understood machines could give. And then he was gone, leaving behind nothing but stories, but myths, and the sound of a fighter slicing the clouds above an Ohio sky. He'd never held rank higher than staff sergeant. He never earned a medal. But he had done something far greater. He had given the Lightning its freedom. And in that freedom, thousands of men had found theirs too. Because sometimes the war isn't won by the ones who follow orders, but by the ones who hear what the metal's been trying to say all along.